Mark Hudson stood outside room 314 with sunflowers in his hand, knowing this wasn't where he was supposed to be. Through the narrow window, he could see her pale against white sheets, alone, in a silence so complete it hurt to witness. No cards on the nightstand, no flowers. No one waiting in the chair by the window. He'd buried his wife 3 years ago in a room that looked exactly like this one. The smart thing would be to walk away, find the right room, forget what he'd seen. Instead, he pushed the door open and set the flowers down beside a woman whose name he didn't know. He told himself it was just kindness, just one small act for someone who shouldn't have to fight cancer alone. But when he walked out of that hospital that afternoon, something had already shifted, because Mark Hudson had spent 3 years running from hospitals, from memories, from the possibility of loss. And now, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman in room 314. Mark Hudson didn't like hospitals. The smell alone brought back memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Disinfectant and something vaguely sweet he could never place. The fluorescent lights that made everything look too bright and too cold at the same time. The sound of monitors beeping in rooms where people waited for news they didn't want to hear. He'd promised himself after Jennifer died that he'd never walk through those doors again unless he absolutely had to. But Paul was an old college friend, and when he'd texted about the appendix surgery, Mark couldn't say no. He'd stopped at the grocery store on the way and picked up sunflowers because Paul had said to bring something cheerful. They felt ridiculous in his hands now, too bright against the gray hallways of the 3rd floor. He'd parked in the visitor lot and sat in his truck for 10 minutes before forcing himself to go inside. His hands had been sweating when he pushed through the automatic doors. His heart had been beating too fast in the elevator, but he'd made it this far, and Paul was expecting him. The hallway stretched out in both directions when he stepped off the elevator. Identical doors on either side. Room numbers in neat black letters. He turned left and counted as he walked. 310. 312. He stopped at the next door and pushed it open with his shoulder eyes on the sunflowers in his hand. It wasn't until he was 3 steps inside that his brain caught up with what he was seeing. This wasn't Paul. This wasn't even a man. A woman lay in the bed, eyes closed, so pale she almost blended into the pillowcase, dark hair spread around her head like someone had arranged it that way. The only sound in the room was the soft beep of a monitor beside her. Mark stood frozen, confused his mind, moving slower than it should have. He glanced back at the door. No nameplate, no chart hanging outside. He turned back to the woman, and that's when he noticed the rest of the room. Empty. Not just empty. Abandoned. No flowers on the nightstand. No cards propped against the lamp. No jacket draped over the chair by the window. No one had been here. Maybe no one was coming. Mark didn't know why he stayed. He should have backed out quietly, found the right room, laughed it off with Paul later. Instead, he looked down at the sunflowers in his hand. They were too cheerful for wherever he was supposed to be anyway. He set them on the small table beside her bed, as quiet as he could, and left without a sound. He found Paul 2 doors down in room 316. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. Paul's surgery had gone fine. He'd be out in a day or 2. Mark nodded and made the right sounds, but his mind kept drifting back to room 314, to the woman lying there alone, to the silence that had felt like a weight pressing down on the whole space. When he left the hospital that afternoon, he told himself he'd forget about it by morning. He got in his truck and drove to Lily's school to pick her up. She climbed into the back seat chattering about her day, about the spelling test she'd aced, and the boy who'd pulled her hair at recess. Mark listened and tried to focus, but something had shifted in his chest, and he couldn't quite name what it was. That night after he put Lily to bed, he sat at the kitchen table and stared at his phone. He thought about texting Paul to ask if he knew anything about the woman in 314, but that felt strange, like admitting he cared about something that wasn't his business. He set the phone down and went to bed, but he didn't sleep well. He kept seeing that empty room, the woman's pale face, the silence. It reminded him too much of the last weeks with Jennifer, when their friends had stopped visiting because it was too hard to watch her fade, when the only people who showed up were him and the nurses. 3 days passed, and Mark couldn't stop thinking about it. He told himself it was just curiosity. He wanted to know if the flowers were still there, or if someone had finally shown up. He didn't plan to go inside. He just wanted to check. On Thursday afternoon, he drove back to the hospital. He told Lily he had an errand to run and dropped her at his sister's place for an hour. The drive felt longer than it should have. His hands were tight on the steering wheel. His stomach felt like it was tied in knots. He parked in the same spot and walked through the same automatic doors. Took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The hallway looked exactly the same. He walked past room 314, once glanced through the small window in the door. The sunflowers were still on the table, wilting now. The woman was awake, staring at the ceiling. Mark kept walking. He made it to the elevator before he stopped. His hand hovered over the button, and something caught in his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was easy to ignore. This was something else, something that reminded him of sitting alone in his kitchen 3 years ago after the funeral, when Lily had finally fallen asleep and the house had gone silent. He'd wished just once that someone had left him flowers. Someone who wasn't obligated to care, but chose to anyway. He turned around and walked back to the nurse's station. A woman with graying hair looked up from her computer. Her name tag said, Carol. Mark cleared his throat. "I wanted to ask about the woman in room 314, he said. Carol hesitated, her eyes scanning his face like she was deciding whether to trust him. Whatever she saw, there must have convinced her he wasn't a threat, because she leaned back in her chair and sighed. Sophie Grant, she said quietly, 38 years old, stage 3 lymphoma. She's been here 2 weeks now, responding to treatment, but it's slow. Mark nodded. He didn't ask the question he really wanted to ask. Carol answered it anyway. No visitors. Not one. Mark felt something drop in his stomach. Not since she was admitted, Carol shook her head. Not one. Mark thanked her and walked back to the elevator. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes before he could bring himself to start the engine. That night after Lily went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table again and made a list. Small things. Things that wouldn't mean much to anyone else, but might mean something to someone who was alone. A book, a blanket, a card. Things that said someone was thinking about her even if she didn't know who. The next day he brought a paperback mystery novel he'd read twice and liked enough to pass on. He didn't go into the room. He left it with Carol and asked her to put it on the table. The day after that he brought a small potted succulent, something that wouldn't die as fast as flowers. Then a soft gray blanket. Then a card with a landscape on the front and nothing written inside. He never stayed long. He never introduced himself. He didn't want credit. He just wanted her to know that someone was thinking about her, that she wasn't as alone as that room made her feel. 2 weeks passed, and Mark kept coming. He started to recognize the nurses, and they started to recognize him. Carol smiled every time she saw him. She never asked why. She just took whatever he brought and promised to leave it where Sophie would see it. Mark didn't know if Sophie noticed. He didn't know if she cared. He told himself it didn't matter. But every time he walked away from that hospital, he felt a little less hollow, a little more like he was doing something that mattered. Then one afternoon, Carol stopped him before he could leave. She had a strange look on her face, not worried exactly, more like she was holding back a secret. She's asking about you, Carol said. Mark felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't planned for this to become real. What did you tell her? He asked. Carol shrugged. I told her I didn't know your name, but she's getting better, sitting up now, talking more. She might be discharged in a few weeks. Mark nodded slowly. Part of him wanted to disappear before it got complicated. The other part, the part he didn't like to admit existed, wanted to meet her, to see if the person matched the image he'd built in his head. He didn't decide right away. He left the hospital and drove home, picked up Lily from school, made dinner, helped with homework. Normal life. Safe life. But that night, lying in bed, he kept thinking about what Carol had said. She's getting better. He'd started this because she was alone, because no one should go through something like that without knowing someone cared. But now she was asking questions. Now she wanted to know. The next day he brought a small journal, something she could write in if she wanted. He handed it to Carol like always, but before he could leave she shook her head. "You should give it to her yourself," Carol said. Mark stared at her. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" He didn't have an answer, at least not one that made sense out loud. Carol just smiled. "Room 314, she's awake." Mark stood there, holding the journal, feeling cornered. He walked down the hallway slowly, stopped outside her door, and looked through the window. Sophie was sitting up in bed, reading the book he'd left 2 weeks ago. Her hair was pulled back, and she looked stronger than the first time he'd seen her, still pale, still thin, but alive. He knocked softly. She looked up, and their eyes met through the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she smiled. Just a small one, but it was enough. Mark opened the door and stepped inside. "Hi," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Hi," Sophie said. She set the book down on her lap. "You're the one who's been leaving things." It wasn't a question, but Mark nodded anyway. "I wasn't sure you were real," she said. "I thought maybe the nurses were just being nice." "They are nice," Mark said. "But no, it was me." Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Not suspicious, just curious, like she was trying to figure out why a stranger would do something like this. "Why?" she asked. Mark didn't have a good answer. He thought about lying, making up something simple. But standing there looking at her, he realized she deserved the truth, or at least the closest thing to it he could manage. "I walked into the wrong room," he said. "And you were alone. I guess I just thought. No one should be that alone." Something in Sophie's eyes softened. She nodded once, like she understood more than he'd said. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mark held out the journal. "I brought this, in case you wanted to write or draw or just have something to do." She took it from him and ran her fingers over the cover. "I used to write," she said. "Before all this. Maybe you still can," Mark said. Sophie looked up at him again, and this time she smiled a little wider. "Maybe." Mark didn't know what else to say. He felt like he'd crossed a line he couldn't step back over. This wasn't anonymous anymore. This was real. And real meant complicated. "I should go," he said. "Will you come back?" Sophie asked. Mark hesitated. He thought about Lily, about the carefully controlled life he'd built to protect them both, about how easy it would be to say no and walk away clean. "Yeah," he said, "I'll come back." And he did. Mark came back the next afternoon. He told himself it was just to check in, to make sure she was doing okay. But when he walked into her room and saw her sitting up with the journal open on her lap, he realized he'd been looking forward to it. That scared him more than he wanted to admit. Sophie looked up and smiled. It was careful, like she wasn't sure how much energy to spend on it, but it was real. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Mark replied. He stood near the door, unsure whether to sit or stay standing. The chair by her bed felt too close, too personal. "You can sit," Sophie said. "I don't bite." Mark sat down. The room felt smaller with both of them in it. He could hear the faint hum of the machines, the air conditioning cycling on. Sophie closed the journal and set it aside. "I started writing again," she said. "Just a little. I forgot how much I missed it." "What do you write about?" Mark asked. Sophie looked out the window. "Things I notice. Small things. Like the way the light hits the wall in the morning or the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Things that remind me I'm still here." Mark nodded. He understood that more than she knew. After Jennifer died, he'd done the same thing. Not writing, but noticing. Counting the small details of the day just to prove time was still moving. They talked for 20 minutes. Nothing heavy. She asked what he did for work, and he told her he managed inventory at a warehouse. She asked if he liked it, and he said it paid the bills. She didn't ask about his personal life, and he was grateful for that. He wasn't ready to talk about Lily yet, or about why he was alone. When he left that day, he felt lighter, but also more tangled. He'd started this to help someone. Now he didn't know what it was becoming. Over the next 2 weeks, Mark visited 4 more times. Each visit felt easier. Sophie was getting stronger. Her color was coming back. She could sit up longer without getting tired. The nurses said her latest scans looked promising. The treatment was working. She might be discharged by the end of the month. Mark should have been happy for her. He was. But there was something else underneath. A quiet dread that once she left this thing they were building would disappear. He didn't know how to hold on to something that had no structure. One afternoon, Sophie asked him the question he'd been avoiding. "Why don't you ever talk about yourself?" she said. Mark looked at her. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, now stronger than she'd been in weeks. Her eyes were sharp, direct. "I talk about myself," Mark said. "No," Sophie said. "You talk about work, about the weather, about the cafeteria coffee, but you don't talk about you." Mark shifted in his chair. "There's not much to say." "I don't believe that." Mark looked down at his hands. He'd worked hard to keep this part of his life separate, to not let it bleed into the fragile thing they were building. But Sophie wasn't going to let him hide. "I have a daughter," Mark said finally. "Her name's Lily. She's 8. Sophie's expression softened. "You're a dad." "Yeah. Where's her mom?" Mark felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer." The room went quiet. Sophie didn't say she was sorry. She didn't offer empty comfort. She just looked at him like she understood. Like she knew what it meant to lose something you couldn't get back. "That's why you were here," Sophie said quietly. "That's why you walked into the wrong room." Mark nodded. "I was visiting a friend. But yeah, I don't come to hospitals unless I have to." "And you kept coming back," Sophie said, "even though it probably hurt." Mark didn't answer. He didn't know how to explain that helping her had been easier than sitting alone with his own grief. That for a few minutes every week, he got to focus on someone else's survival instead of his own loss. Sophie reached over and touched his hand, just briefly. Then she pulled back. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." Mark left the hospital that day feeling raw. He picked up Lily from school and took her to the park. They sat on the swings, and she told him about her day. About the math test she'd aced and the art project she was working on. Mark listened and tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the hospital. To Sophie. To the way she'd looked at him when he told her about Jennifer. That night after Lily went to bed, he sat on the porch and stared out at the dark street. He thought about calling Carol to ask how Sophie was doing, but that felt like crossing another line. He went to bed instead. He didn't visit the next day, or the day after that. He told himself he was busy, that Lily needed him, that he was getting too involved. But the truth was he was afraid. Afraid of what it meant that he looked forward to seeing Sophie. Afraid that he was starting to feel something he had no right to feel. On the 4th day, Carol called him. "She's asking for you," Carol said. Mark felt his stomach drop. "Is she okay?" "Physically, yes. But she noticed you stopped coming. I think she's worried you're not coming back." Mark closed his eyes. "I'll be there tomorrow." He showed up the next afternoon with a bag of books he'd picked up from a used bookstore. When he walked into Sophie's room, she looked up with an expression he couldn't quite read. Relief, maybe, or something close to it. "I thought you disappeared," she said. Mark set the bag of books on the table. "I'm sorry. I got caught up with things." Sophie nodded, but she didn't look convinced. You don't have to keep coming. You know. I'll be okay. Mark looked at her. I know. But I want to. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. Good. They fell into a rhythm after that. Mark visited 3 times a week. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. Sophie told him about her life before the hospital. She'd been a freelance graphic designer working from home, keeping to herself. She didn't have family nearby. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was in college, and she'd never been close with extended relatives. She'd had friends once, but over the years they'd drifted. By the time she got sick, there was no one left to call. Mark told her about Lily, about how hard it had been to raise a daughter alone, about the guilt he carried for not being enough. Sophie listened without judgment. She didn't try to fix anything. She just let him talk. One afternoon, Mark brought Lily with him. He'd been putting it off, but Lily had started asking questions. Where do you go on Thursdays? Who are you visiting? Mark had run out of excuses. Lily walked into the hospital room with wide eyes, holding Mark's hand tight. Sophie smiled at her from the bed. You must be Lily, Sophie said. Lily nodded shyly. Your dad's told me a lot about you, Sophie said. He says you're really good at math. Lily's face lit up. I got 100 on my last test. That's amazing, Sophie said. I was terrible at math. Lily giggled. Mark watched them talk, and something in his chest loosened. Lily asked Sophie about the hospital with the blunt curiosity only kids could get away with. What's it like to be sick? Lily asked. Does it hurt? Are you going to get better? Sophie answered honestly but gently. She told Lily that sometimes it hurt, but the doctors were helping, that she was getting better every day. By the time they left, Lily was chattering about how nice Sophie was and asking when they could visit again. Mark realized, driving home, that he'd let this become part of his life, part of Lily's life. And he didn't know if that was a mistake or the best thing he'd done in years. 2 weeks later, Sophie was discharged. The doctors said her scans were clean. The treatment had worked. She'd need follow-up appointments, but for now she was in remission. Mark helped her pack the few things she'd accumulated in the hospital. The books, the blanket, the wilted sunflowers she'd kept in a vase even after they'd dried out. What are you going to do now? Mark asked. Sophie folded the blanket carefully. I don't know. Go home, I guess. Try to figure out what normal looks like. Do you have someone to help you? Mark asked. Sophie shook her head. I'll be okay. I've been alone before. Mark didn't like the sound of that. He thought about her going back to an empty apartment, recovering alone with no one to check on her. It felt wrong. You have my number, Mark said, if you need anything. Sophie smiled. I know. They exchanged a few more words, and then Sophie left with a nurse to finish the discharge paperwork. Mark stood in the empty room, looking at the bed she'd been in for weeks. He felt the weight of something ending, or maybe just changing. He didn't hear from her for 3 days. Then she texted him. Made it home. Thank you for everything. Mark stared at the text for a long time before responding. Glad you're okay. Let me know if you need anything. He thought that would be it, that they'd drift into polite distance. But a week later, she texted again. Want to meet for coffee? Mark said yes before he could talk himself out of it. They met at a small cafe near the hospital. Sophie looked different outside the sterile room, healthier. Her hair was longer, pulled into a loose ponytail. She wore a sweater that was too big for her, but it made her look comfortable. Real. They talked for an hour about nothing and everything. Sophie told him she'd been working again, picking up small freelance projects. Mark told her about Lily's upcoming school play. It felt normal, easy, like they'd known each other longer than a few months. When they said goodbye, Mark felt something shift. This wasn't just kindness anymore. This was something else. Over the next month, they met for coffee twice more. Then Sophie invited him and Lily over for dinner. She cooked pasta, and Lily helped set the table. They ate together, and for the first time in years, Mark's kitchen table didn't feel empty. But underneath the ease, he could feel the fear creeping back. He was starting to care about Sophie more than he'd planned, more than felt safe. And every time he let himself feel it, he thought about Jennifer, about losing her, about the years of grief that had followed. He didn't know if he could survive that again. One night after putting Lily to bed, Mark sat on the edge of his mattress and stared at his phone. Sophie had texted him earlier. Just a picture of a sunset from her window. He'd sent back a thumbs up, but he hadn't called, hadn't pushed further. He was afraid of getting close, afraid of what it would mean if he admitted he wanted more than friendship, afraid that wanting something good would only lead to losing it. The next week, Sophie had a follow-up appointment, routine scans, nothing to worry about, the doctors had said. But when Mark texted to ask how it went, she didn't respond. He tried calling. No answer. He waited 2 days, and the silence felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Finally, Carol called him. "Sophie's back in the hospital," she said. Mark felt the floor drop out from under him. "What happened?" "The scan showed something. They're running more tests. She didn't want me to tell you, but I thought you should know." Mark hung up and drove straight to the hospital. He found Sophie in a different room this time, smaller. She was sitting on the bed, staring at the wall. When she saw him, her face crumpled. "I thought it was over," she said. Her voice broke. "I thought I was done." Mark sat beside her and took her hand. He didn't have words. He didn't have answers. All he had was the choice to stay or leave. And for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't running. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Sophie looked at him, and tears slid down her face. "You should. You should leave before this gets worse." Mark shook his head. "No, I'm going to be a burden," Sophie said. "I can't ask you to do this." "You're not asking," Mark said. "I'm choosing." "Why?" Sophie asked. "Why would you choose this?" Mark's answer came out steady and sure. "Because walking away now would be the biggest mistake of my life." Sophie closed her eyes, and Mark held her hand while she cried. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the scans would be bad, or if this was just a scare. But he knew that leaving now would haunt him forever. The tests took 3 days. 3 days of waiting while Sophie sat in that small hospital room and tried to pretend she wasn't terrified. Mark came every day. He brought Lily once, and she drew pictures at the foot of Sophie's bed, while Mark sat in the chair and read out loud from a book Sophie had mentioned liking. They didn't talk about the scans. They didn't talk about what would happen if the news was bad. They just existed in the same space, and somehow that was enough. On the 3rd day, the doctor came in with results. Mark stood up to leave to give Sophie privacy, but she reached for his hand and held it tight. The doctor looked between them, then sat down and opened the file. "The scans are clear," he said. Sophie's grip on Mark's hand loosened. She let out a breath she'd been holding for days. Mark felt his own chest unclench. The doctor explained it was scar tissue from the original treatment. It had shown up differently on this scan, which was why they'd flagged it. But there was no new growth. She was still in remission. He went over follow-up plans and scheduled another scan in 3 months, then left them alone. Mark sat back down. Sophie looked at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked angry. "I can't keep doing this," she said. "Doing what?" Mark asked, waiting for the next scare, waiting to see if it comes back. "I can't live like that." Mark understood. He'd felt the same way after Jennifer died. The fear that every cough, every headache, every moment of fatigue meant something terrible was coming. It had taken him years to stop bracing for disaster. "You don't have a choice," Mark said quietly. "You just have to live anyway." "Is that what you did?" Sophie asked. "No," Mark said honestly. "I shut down, stopped living for a long time. But I'm trying not to do that anymore." Sophie reached for his hand again, slower this time, more deliberate. Because of me. Mark thought about the past few months, about how helping her had pulled him out of the fog he'd been living in, about how she'd made him want something more than just surviving. Yeah, he said, because of you. Sophie was discharged the next day. This time, Mark drove her home. Her apartment was small and neat, filled with plants and books, and the kind of quiet that came from living alone for too long. Mark helped her carry in the few things she'd had at the hospital. When he set the bag down, Sophie turned to him. "I don't want to be alone right now," she said. Mark looked at her. She wasn't asking for anything specific, just presence, just someone to sit with while the fear settled. "I'll stay," he said. They sat on her couch and talked until it got dark. Sophie told him about the years before she got sick, about the friends she'd lost touch with because she'd been too proud to ask for help, about the loneliness that had built up so slowly she hadn't noticed until it was too late. Mark told her about the months after Jennifer died, about how he'd barely kept it together for Lily, about how he'd convinced himself that being alone was safer than risking loss again. "But you're not alone anymore," Sophie said. Mark looked at her. "Neither are you." Something shifted between them in that moment. Not a declaration, not a promise, just an acknowledgement that they'd both chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. Over the next few weeks, Mark and Sophie fell into a new rhythm. He still visited, but now it wasn't about checking on a patient. It was about spending time with someone who understood him, someone who'd seen him at his most vulnerable and hadn't run. Lily started calling Sophie by name instead of Dad's friend. Sophie started keeping extra snacks in her apartment for when Lily came over. One Saturday afternoon, Lily asked Sophie if she wanted to come to her school play. Sophie looked at Mark, uncertain, and he nodded. Sophie said yes. She sat in the audience between Mark and an empty seat that used to belong to Jennifer. When Lily came on stage dressed as a tree, Sophie clapped louder than anyone. After the play, they went out for ice cream. Lily ordered chocolate with sprinkles and talked non-stop about the performance. Sophie listened with the kind of attention that made Lily glow. Mark watched them and realized something he'd been avoiding for months. He was falling for her. Maybe he already had. That night, after Lily went to bed, Mark sat on his porch and called Sophie. "Hey," she said when she picked up. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Mark said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a beat of silence. Then Sophie laughed softly. "You saw me 3 hours ago." "I know." Another silence. This one felt different, heavier. "Mark," Sophie said carefully. "What are we doing?" Mark looked out at the dark street. "I don't know, but I don't want to stop." "I'm scared," Sophie said. "Me too." "What if it comes back?" Sophie asked. "What if I get sick again and you're stuck with me?" Mark's chest tightened. "Then I'm stuck with you." "That's not fair to you," Sophie said. "Or to Lily." "Let me decide what's fair," Mark said. Sophie went quiet. Mark could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "I care about you," Mark said. "I didn't plan to, but I do. And I'm not walking away because you're scared. I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe and alone." Sophie's voice cracked when she spoke. "I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I," Mark said. "But we'll figure it out." They stayed on the phone for another hour talking about nothing and everything. When they finally hung up, Mark felt lighter than he had in years. The next morning, Sophie showed up at his door. She looked nervous, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "I want to try," she said. "I want to try this with you. But I need you to know I might mess it up. I've been alone for a long time. I don't know how to let someone in." "That's okay," Mark said. "We'll figure it out together." Sophie stepped forward and kissed him. It was soft and tentative, like she was testing whether this was real. Mark kissed her back, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel guilty. He didn't feel like he was betraying Jennifer's memory. He just felt like he was allowed to be happy again. Over the next 6 months, they built something real. It wasn't perfect. Sophie had bad days where the fear crept back in, and Mark had moments where he retreated into himself. But they learned to talk through it, to be honest when things were hard, to ask for help instead of pretending they were fine. Lily adored Sophie. She started asking when Sophie was coming over, started including her in drawings she made at school. Sophie bought Lily a sketchbook and taught her how to draw basic shapes. They spent hours at the kitchen table together, pencils scratching across paper, while Mark cooked dinner and tried not to think about how much this felt like a family. One evening after Lily had gone to bed, Sophie and Mark sat on the couch together. Sophie had her head on his shoulder, and Mark was half watching a movie neither of them cared about. "I've been thinking," Sophie said. "About what?" Mark asked. "About the future." Mark's heart picked up. "What about it?" Sophie sat up and looked at him. "I know this is fast. I know we've only been together a few months, but I don't want to waste time pretending I don't know what I want." Mark waited. "I want this," Sophie said. "I want you. I want Lily. I want to build a life with you however long I get." Mark felt something catch in his throat. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Sophie smiled. "Maybe. Is that crazy?" "Probably," Mark said. "But I don't care." They got married 3 months later. It was a small ceremony in the backyard of Mark's house, just a few friends. Carol from the hospital. Lily in a yellow dress carrying a bouquet of sunflowers. Sophie wore a simple white dress, and Mark wore a suit he'd bought the day before. There was no big speech, no grand gesture, just two people choosing each other in front of the people who mattered. When the officiant asked if they took each other, Mark said yes without hesitation. Sophie said yes with tears in her eyes. Lily clapped so loud everyone laughed. After the ceremony, they cut a small cake and ate on paper plates in the grass. Lily ran around with the other kids, and Sophie leaned against Mark's shoulder. "I never thought I'd get this," she said quietly. "Me neither," Mark said. "Do you think it'll last?" Sophie asked. Mark looked at her. "I think we'll fight for it, and that's enough." Sophie kissed him, and Mark wrapped his arms around her. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if the cancer would come back, or if they'd have 50 years together, or 5. But he knew that walking into the wrong room had been the best mistake of his life. Because sometimes the wrong turn leads you exactly where you're supposed to be. Sometimes kindness doesn't need a reason. Sometimes love isn't about perfect timing or perfect people. It's about choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. It's about showing up day after day, even when you're scared. Mark had spent 3 years running from the possibility of loss, but Sophie had taught him something he'd forgotten, that life wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about finding someone worth risking it for, and she was worth it. Lily ran up to them out of breath and grinning. "Can we have more cake?" Sophie laughed. "Yes, absolutely." Mark watched them walk toward the table together, and he felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty, not the promise that everything would be okay, just the knowledge that he wasn't alone anymore, that he'd found his way back to living. And that was enough. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. The guests were starting to pack up, and the music had faded to a soft hum. Mark stood there, watching his daughter and his wife laugh over frosting, and he made a silent promise to keep showing up, to keep choosing love even when it was hard, to keep walking through the wrong doors until he found the right ones. Because in the end, that's all any of them could do. Keep moving, keep hoping, keep believing that the next room might hold exactly what they'd been looking for all along.